Maya stood in the cemetery compliance office with rainwater drying on her sleeves, a folded receipt book in one hand, and a ribbon burn across her thumb where she had tied stems too fast. Linda was already speaking before the door had fully closed, her voice smooth enough for strangers and sharp enough for family, explaining that Maya had no authority to touch premium stock and no right to carry private records into an administrative meeting. Ruth Alvarez sat behind the side table with a grey file open to payroll forms Maya had never been allowed to see, and the trust attorney arrived a minute late, set a leather folder beside the coffee pot, and greeted the quiet man by the window without any introduction at all. "Mr. Carson, we need your signature on the tenant termination order." Maya did not move at first because movement would have looked like panic, and she had spent 3 years learning how to stay still while the ground shifted. The man she had sold flowers to every Friday turned from the window in plain, dark work clothes. No tie, no watch. Anyone would notice. And for a second, her mind tried to place him back where she knew him, at her counter with $28 in folded bills and a request for white lilies that never changed. Linda kept speaking, trying to keep control of the room through volume and procedure, and Ruth slid one paper closer to Maya so she could see the wage lines in black print. Promised 95, paid 55. 14 months in a clean sequence that made her stomach pull tight. He signed nothing yet. He looked at Maya once, not asking for recognition and not offering apology for concealment, just waiting while the attorney explained cure periods and breach terms as if this were a normal Friday and not the moment every quiet conversation at her stall had become something else. She could hear rain on the office awning, and she could hear Linda say, with a laugh too high to be natural, that this was all a misunderstanding around family bookkeeping. Maya knew that tone. It was the tone used when Linda wanted to make someone feel childish for noticing harm. 9 Fridays earlier, Maya had been cutting stems before sunrise at the Mitchell Bloom stall beside the North Cemetery gate, counting inventory while her tea cooled and the first buses hissed past on wet pavement. Spring had just settled into town, and she had begun opening alone because Linda preferred to arrive when customers were already lined up and could watch her take credit for a clean display. Maya trimmed each stem to match vase depth by habit, wiped water rings before they formed, and moved wilted bunches to the side table, where she sometimes bought them herself for reduced price, so Linda could not accuse her of waste. Her mother had died in 2023, and because Maya had turned 19 the same month, the transfer paperwork had happened quickly. Guardianship language folded into business language so neatly. She had signed where she was told and kept working 6 days a week inside a structure she did not fully understand. Linda called it practical family management. Maya called it rent and groceries, and one safe place in town where she still felt close to her mother, because the stall smelled the same in the mornings, damp stems and eucalyptus and cardboard, and her mother had taught her that clean water in every bucket mattered more than fancy ribbon. The promise had been simple when Linda said it aloud, $95 a day, 6 days weekly, with room for raises once summer weddings started. The envelope Maya received at week's end held $55 a day, counted in front of her, and each time she asked why the number changed, Linda pointed at overhead costs she never itemized and said adults understood cash flow. Maya stopped asking in public because questions gave Linda an audience. She started keeping her own notebook in the lining of her apron, writing every shift, every payment, every shortage she was told to absorb. The first Friday he appeared, she noticed his shoes before his face, clean but old leather with soil pressed into the edges, the kind of shoes someone wore for real walking and not for display. He waited while 2 commuters bought quick bouquets, did not move forward when they argued over change, and stepped up only when the counter was clear. White lilies, 3 roses, eucalyptus, he said, voice low, as if the request had already been rehearsed. Wrapped in plain paper. Maya nodded, built it in silence, and told him the price, $28. He counted cash from his wallet with no hesitation, exact amount, and thanked her as if she had done him a personal favor. When she set the bouquet down, she saw one lily with a bruised petal and swapped it for a better stem before he could notice. Linda hated substitutions after pricing, and Maya knew she would be scolded if inventory came up short. She added one sprig of wax flower from the side bucket, not charged, because the bouquet looked unfinished without a soft edge. That sprig cost pennies from her own daily margin, and she added it anyway. He glanced at the stems once, then at her, as if measuring what that tiny correction meant in a place where nobody else corrected anything for free. He came back the next Friday at the same hour, again with cash, again with the same request, and Maya prepared the paper before he reached the counter because routine made mornings easier. By the third Friday, she knew he preferred stems tied lower, so the bouquet sat flatter against stone. By the fourth, she noticed he never asked for a vase even when rain was expected, and she began wrapping an extra layer beneath the paper to keep water from leaking onto his sleeves. He accepted each change with a brief nod and almost no words, and that reserve should have felt cold, yet it felt respectful, as if he understood labor and did not treat her hands as invisible. Linda noticed the regular customer too, and she noticed the cash first. On the fifth Friday, she stepped in while Maya was ringing up a church order and took his 28 herself, smiling in a way she only used for people she thought might spend more later. "My niece is still learning speed," she said, standing too close to Maya's shoulder. "If you want quality, ask for me." He looked at Linda once, then at Maya, and answered, "She already knows what I need." He did not raise his voice, and he did not look away until Linda moved back. That small sentence changed the next week. Linda began timing Maya's wraps with a kitchen timer she set on the back shelf, clicking her tongue when orders ran over 2 minutes, announcing mistakes in front of customers that were not mistakes at all. "You tied these too tight," she said once, loosening a bow that had held perfectly. "You people always overwork simple things." Maya kept her face neutral and retied the ribbon while a line of customers watched the lesson like public entertainment. Her ears burned, and she could feel the familiar pressure behind her eyes, but she counted stems in her head and kept her breathing even. The sixth Friday brought rain that started before dawn and never lifted. He arrived late, jacket damp at the shoulders, asked for the same bouquet, and paused while Maya wrapped the stems under the awning. Water dripped from the canvas edge in a constant line between them. "You open in this weather every week?" he asked. 6 days, she said. "Friday is only louder." He gave a brief, almost private smile at that, paid in cash as usual, and left through the side path instead of the main gate. Maya watched him go only long enough to make sure the paper held in the rain. By then, Maya had learned the shape of his silences. He never asked her name, never offered his, and never looked around for who might be watching. The absence of performance made him easier to trust than customers who complimented too much. On the 7th Friday, when Linda disappeared for a smoke break and a school custodian asked for discounted carnations he could not afford full price for, Maya gave him 2 extra stems from her own stock note and marked them paid from tips. Michael stood 2 customers back and saw the exchange. He said nothing, though his eyes rested on the ledger card a second longer than usual. The 8th Friday began with a delayed funeral delivery to the East Hill plots, and Linda barked at Maya to carry it herself because the van driver was already gone. The arrangement was heavier than it looked. white mums and fern in a foam base that leaked cold water down Maya's wrist as she walked the gravel lane inside the cemetery. She passed old oak rows, reading names she did not know, and near plot C14 she saw him ahead by a polished stone with fresh rain beading on engraved letters. He was kneeling, not praying in a visible way, just setting the bouquet flat against the base with both hands and straightening each stem as if each one mattered. The name on the stone read, Evelyn Carson, 1989 to 2018. Maya stopped behind a yew hedge and stayed there a breath too long, because she had no right to stand in that private moment and no strength to turn away quickly without dropping the arrangement. She watched him touch the stone once with his fingertips before he rose, and the movement looked practiced, anniversary deep, a ritual that had kept him upright through years she could only imagine from a date on granite. She continued to the East Hill and delivered the order with her hair wet at the temples, then returned by a different path so she would not cross him and force explanation where none was owed. That evening, Linda closed cash and docked Maya $15 for delay losses tied to a wilted aisle display that had wilted because Linda had left it in sun. Maya noted the deduction in her hidden notebook and did not argue. She felt the grave image still in her chest, not as gossip, not as curiosity, more as a new line she had to carry carefully, the knowledge that the quiet man's Fridays were not habit for convenience, they were grief, scheduled down to the hour. The next morning, she added one extra wrap layer to his usual paper stack without thinking about it. The week after that, the wound came from a doorway she had no reason to fear. Maya had gone back for twine in the storage room behind the stall, and voices drifted through the half-open office door, where Linda stood with a local broker whose shoes clicked on concrete. "The lease transfer is clean if I sign before quarter end," Linda said, tapping a folder. "Girl has no claim. She gets sentimental and stays. That is her issue." The broker asked about staff continuity, and Linda laughed, short and bored. "She can sell gas station bouquets for all I care." Maya did not step closer, and she did not make a sound. She backed out, set the twine on the prep table, finished 3 sympathy wraps with precise corners, and answered customer questions in a voice that sounded like her own from far away. When the line cleared, she went into the walk-in cooler, shut the door, and braced both hands on a milk crate until the shaking in her forearms eased. She sat on an overturned bucket for 1 minute, counted 10 slow breaths twice, wiped her face with her sleeve, and returned to the counter before Linda came looking for another target. The obstacle she had lived with until then had a shape she could tolerate. Low pay, public shaming, long shifts, because she believed endurance would keep her place at the stall her mother built. Hearing no claim removed even that false stability. She had been unable to act because she thought she still had time. After that sentence, waiting became another form of surrender. She went to Ruth Alvarez at lunch the next day, carrying only her notebook and the courage it took to ask for procedure in a room where she had always stood as a customer. Ruth worked the cemetery office window, processing plot maps and permit forms with the kind of patience that made people lower their voices. Maya explained as little as possible, only dates, wages, deductions, and the overheard lease sale. Ruth listened without interruption, then set out the only formal path available: complaint number first, wage affidavit second, payroll release request third. "I cannot release payroll records to you without the complaint number," Ruth said. "And once you file, the records become visible to compliance." Maya signed the complaint form with a pen that left ink on her finger, and received a stamped copy she folded into her apron lining, beside her notebook. Filing the complaint opened one door and closed another. Linda was informed by mail that a payroll inquiry had been initiated, and she spent 2 evenings accusing Maya of betrayal without naming the complaint directly. "You think paper will feed you," she said while counting cash at the back counter. "Family gave you a roof when nobody else wanted this mess." Maya stood by the sink, rinsing vase buckets, water running over her wrists, and answered only practical questions about tomorrow's delivery list. She had learned that defense invited escalation. Silence left less for Linda to use. Friday arrived again, the 9th in the sequence she now measured almost by heartbeat. A widow named Mrs. Hanley came before noon with trembling hands and an envelope she had been saving for months, asking for a simple funeral arrangement for her sister, white mums and blue delphinium, paid in advance because she feared forgetting later while handling paperwork. Maya wrote the order carefully, totaled $140, and placed the envelope in the register tray, while Mrs. Hanley repeated the service time twice. Linda overheard the church location, shook her head, and said that parish paid late and she would not release premium stems for uncertain clients. Mrs. Hanley whispered that she had already paid. Linda said payment did not guarantee service if management declined risk. Mrs. Hanley's face changed in a way Maya recognized from mirrors after bad nights, the quick collapse someone tries to hide from strangers. Maya looked at the schedule board and saw exactly what refusal would do. One more family standing at a graveside without the flowers they had planned for the person they loved. She could still avoid open conflict by doing nothing. She picked up the order card, moved to the cooler, and began selecting stems. Linda told her to put them back. Maya kept cutting, tied the base, checked water, and loaded the finished arrangement into the van herself. She drove to the church, set the flowers by the altar rail, and left before the family arrived. Completing that order at her own risk resolved her private paralysis in one concrete act. She had been unable to place anyone's need above Linda's punishments because retaliation could cost her shelter and work in the same hour. Once she delivered the arrangement anyway, retaliation was no longer hypothetical, and that made the next decision easier. She drove straight from the church to the cemetery office for the scheduled compliance meeting Ruth had arranged under the complaint file, bringing the signed order card and register duplicate that showed $140 received. Ruth added the card to a stack of payroll entries and lease clauses, including a posted cure notice Linda had ignored for 30 days. Inside that meeting room, Linda tried to reframe everything as family disagreement. She said Maya was emotional after bereavements, unreliable with money, confused about wage structures she had accepted. Ruth answered with dates and documents, naming each discrepancy without raising her voice. The attorney summarized the lease language, tenant obligations, and wage theft exposure tied to the complaint. Maya sat with both feet flat on tile, hearing her own pulse in her ears, while rain thinned outside and someone in the hall wheeled a cart past the door. Then the quiet customer from every Friday became the man the room deferred to, in a single line spoken by another person. "Mr. Carson, we need your signature on the tenant termination order." The sentence landed without drama in his voice because he had not spoken it. Michael Carson took the folder, reviewed the pages, and signed where flagged while Linda started to protest breach process she had dismissed for weeks. The attorney noted that cure period had expired, labor complaint evidence had established material violation, and tenancy termination would be effective under trust authority with immediate inventory freeze pending transition. Linda demanded private discussion. Michael said, "You may discuss terms with counsel," in the same calm tone he used when asking for lilies. He did not look triumphant. He looked finished. Maya's mind kept returning to details she could reconcile. The exact cash each Friday, the plain clothes, the way he watched interactions when Linda spoke over her, the questions that had seemed incidental. Ruth later explained what had sat in the background all along. Private memorial grounds in town were owned by family trusts with tenant subleases for gate businesses, and the Carson Trust had started an informal tenant behavior audit after repeated complaints from customers and staff. Michael had paid cash to avoid recognition during that audit, because a trust card or signed account receipt would have put his name in daily tenant reconciliations and warned Linda to perform for oversight. Cash kept him unrecognized long enough to document how people were treated when no status signal protected them. In the corridor after the meeting, Linda stood by the exit with her coat over one arm and told Maya she would regret humiliating family. Maya did not answer because the phrase assumed power Linda no longer held. She stepped aside to let an elderly couple pass and carried Ruth's duplicate files to the office copier, where paper fed through in warm sheets that smelled of toner and closure. Her hands were steady now. The shaking had ended when decisions became institutional and no longer depended on Linda's mood. Back pay numbers took another week because the Labour Office required verified shift counts. Maya's notebook matched stall schedule logs day for day. 6 days weekly over 14 months, promised $95 and paid $55, a $40 daily gap that accumulated to a little over $14,000 after adjustments for 2 documented sick days. Seeing the total in writing brought no rush of victory. It brought exhaustion and a quiet anger at how easy underpayment had been while she assumed she was failing to keep up. Linda contested once through counsel, then withdrew when lease records, complaint evidence, and payroll discrepancies aligned across agencies. 2 weeks after the meeting, she removed her remaining boxes from the stall under supervision and surrendered keys to trust administration. The removal was not theatrical. No crowd gathered, no speeches were made, and Maya did not stand outside to watch. She spent that morning scrubbing old adhesive from display glass and replacing cracked bucket labels, restoring function first, because function had always been her language when feelings threatened to flood everything else. The Protected Operating Agreement came that afternoon, drafted in plain terms Maya could understand before signing. She would hold a controlling co-ownership share with trust oversight on tenancy compliance. Wages would run through independent payroll with documented rates, and inventory purchases over set limits would require dual sign-off to prevent unilateral cash diversion. Ruth sat beside her at the table while she read every line slowly. Michael arrived halfway through, waited by the door until she looked up, and asked if she wanted more time. She said she wanted to finish reading. He nodded and stayed silent until she was done. The first Friday after legal transfer felt unfamiliar in the best way. Maya opened the stall before sunrise and found she was no longer bracing for critique that would arrive with Linda's keys. She set fresh stock labels herself, posted wage scales for part-time weekend help, and pinned a small notice by the register that orders for bereavement services would never be declined once prepaid confirmation was issued. Mists. Hanley came by with a thank you card and squeezed Maya's hand without words. The card sat beneath the register all day where only Maya could see it. Michael arrived at his usual hour carrying no sign of office authority. Same plain jacket, same careful pace. He asked for white lilies, 3 roses, eucalyptus, and Maya wrapped them as she always had, adding the waxflower sprig she no longer had to hide. 28, she said. He set the cash down and then an additional receipt request form from Trust Administration, official this time, with a brief note that vendor billing could be converted from cash if she preferred. Maya read it, folded it, and said cash was fine on Fridays. Some rituals needed to keep their shape while everything else changed. Their conversations lengthened in small increments after that. He asked once where she sourced delphinium in winter, and she explained the wholesaler schedules that never matched funeral timing. She asked once whether oak plot soil changed vase life, and he told her East Hill dried faster by noon because wind came unobstructed across the ridge. He still spoke in short, measured sentences, and she still filled silence with work rather than questions she had no right to ask. The difference was that silence no longer felt like concealment built against her. It felt like room they were both allowed to enter at their own pace. One late afternoon in early summer, he asked if she would walk with him after close. Maya locked the stall, turned the sign to shut, and followed him through the north gate path where gravel softened under pines. He carried one bouquet in his left hand, and another, smaller bunch in his right, mixed field stems wrapped in paper she recognized from her own stock. At Evelyn's stone, he set down the lilies and roses, adjusted them with practiced care, and stood in silence until the cemetery bells marked the half-hour. Then he offered the smaller bunch to Maya and nodded toward the lane where her mother's marker stood 2 rows over. She took the bunch and felt her throat tighten, not from spectacle, from precision. He had asked Ruth for the plot location weeks earlier, she realized, and had chosen stems her mother used to sell in summer because he remembered hearing Maya mention them while trimming hydrangea. At her mother's marker, Maya knelt to clear leaf litter from the base, set the flowers in the holder, and pressed soil firm around the stem sleeve the way her mother taught her when she was 12. She did not cry there. She breathed through the ache until it settled into something steadier than pain. When they returned to the main lane, he spoke about Fridays without ornament. Evelyn had died in 2018, and he began with the first Friday after her funeral, counting each Friday as another week he had carried her absence. The same bouquet marked the date each year and the weeks between, an anniversary practice repeated until ritual and survival became the same thing. The routine had started as a way to survive the first year. It had hardened into obligation during the years after, and obligation had kept him standing when he would rather have disappeared into work. Lately, he said, looking ahead and not at Maya, I still come on Fridays because I want to remember, not because I'm afraid of failing a rule. Maya understood that distinction more deeply than she expected. She had also lived by rules that began as protection and became cages, open 6 days, never question deductions in front of customers. Do not show hurt where someone could weaponize it. Hearing him rename ritual as choice gave her language for her own shift. She still opened 6 days because she chose the work, and she still kept her notebook, now for payroll checks and supplier notes, because records were care in written form, not fear. She was no longer enduring a place she might lose overnight. She was building a place she could defend in daylight. Ruth remained at the edge of all this with the same steady presence, never inserting herself where she was not needed. She sent Maya compliance reminders before deadlines, reviewed draft contracts when requested, and once corrected a vendor clause that would have allowed unilateral fee hikes after 90 days. Maya thanked her with a bouquet on the anniversary of Ruth's own mother's passing, and Ruth accepted it with a small, surprised smile that told Maya support had been rare in Ruth's world too. The ally who had seemed silent during hard months had not been indifferent. She had been waiting for a legal path that would hold. Summer weddings increased traffic, and Maya hired 2 part-time assistants at posted rates higher than minimum local standards, paying through verified payroll every Friday evening before lockup. She trained them the way her mother trained her. Cut at an angle, strip leaves below waterline, never fake freshness with cold spray, and never refuse a bereavement order once payment cleared. People in town noticed the stall changed tone. Customers who used to glance over Maya's shoulder for Linda now asked Maya by name. The social map around the gate shifted one transaction at a time, status moving toward the person who had done the work all along. Michael kept coming each Friday, and the pattern remained recognizable enough to feel safe. Some weeks he stood longer, asking about seasonal stock. Some weeks he took the bouquet and left quickly when weather threatened. Maya did not press for declarations, and he did not offer grand ones. One Friday he arrived late with soil on his cuffs and said he had spent the morning renegotiating maintenance contracts for neglected sections of the cemetery trust, then asked whether she would consider supplying those sections at reduced margin until end-of-year budgets reset. She agreed after reviewing costs, and they drafted terms in writing on the office table Ruth lent them. That contract was small in dollar amount and large in meaning. Maya had been unable to trust informal promises after years of manipulated numbers. Written terms with clear margins resolved that hesitation, making partnership possible without asking her to surrender caution that had kept her alive. Michael accepted every revision she requested, including late payment penalties and emergency restock clauses, and his acceptance felt less like concession than respect for the discipline she had built from scarcity. She recognized then that intimacy could include paperwork done well. Autumn came in with colder mornings and earlier dusk. On the 9th month after transition, Maya stood at closing time in front of the stall that now carried both her family name and her own choices, lights warming the buckets from inside while leaves moved along the curb. Michael arrived as she was stacking empty crates and held out one final Friday order card. Same lilies, same roses, same eucalyptus, plus 2 loose stems of lavender for her mother's marker. She wrapped both bunches, took 28 for the first, declined payment for the lavender, and watched him pause as if he understood exactly what that refusal meant, because he had been watching her choices since the first spring rain. They walked to the graves together that evening without speaking much, footsteps measured on gravel, hands full of flowers prepared by the same pair of hands that once worked under someone else's control. At Evelyn's stone he knelt and set the bouquet as he always had. At her mother's marker, Maya did the same. They stood between the 2 rows afterward in a stillness that did not need naming, connected by the dead they honored and the living work they had chosen in full view of each other. When they returned to the gate, Maya looked back at Mitchell Blooms and saw no trace of the old fear that had once lived in her shoulders from open to close. The stall was hers in law and in practice, co-owned under terms she understood, staffed by people paid what they were promised, anchored in a town she now remained in by choice instead of necessity. Michael stayed beside her at the curb, not as a secret folded into plain clothes, not as a title that had to be hidden, simply as the man who had seen a small act of care when it cost her something, and had never looked away from what that act revealed.